In order for Hydra-Cell pumps to operate properly and deliver the proper performance, the oil in the hydraulic cells behind the diaphragm must be free of air. By priming the hydraulic cells, we remove that air from the hydraulic cells to provide a smooth, efficient performance for the pump. Air can become entrained in the hydraulic cells during disassembly and reassembly of the hydraulic end of the pump. Also, operating the pump with low oil level in the reservoir may allow air to become entrained in the oil. As there are some differences in the procedures, we will now describe how to prime the hydraulic cells of both Kel-Cell and non-Kel-Cell pumps. Kel-Cell pumps have the letter K in the 5th position of the model number. Non-Kel-Cell pumps do not have a K in the 5th position. Please select the appropriate priming procedure from Priming Hydraulic Cells segments on the left of the screen. Now we will see how to prime the hydraulic cells on Kel-Cell pumps. Please note, providing oil prime to Kel-Cell fitted pumps requires pressure be applied to the diaphragms. This can be done manually or with pressurized air if available. Review both methods to determine the procedure most suitable. We will now see a method for manually priming the hydraulic cells for Kel-Cell pumps. Make sure the hydraulic end is filled with oil before priming. With the pump horizontal and the fluid end head removed and the diaphragms installed, fill the reservoir with the appropriate Hydra oil for the application. Make sure that the oil drain cap has been installed. Have a catch basin for oil that flows from behind the diaphragms when priming. Catch the oil and dispose of it properly. Do not reuse it. All air in the oil within the hydraulic piston behind the diaphragms will be forced out by turning the shaft, thus pumping the piston. A shaft rotator is included in the Hydra-Cell toolkit. Push on the diaphragm screws to keep pressure on the diaphragms while turning the shaft. Continue to check the oil level in the hydraulic end of the pump while turning the shaft. Maintain the oil level above the holes in the reservoir. Continue turning the shaft and checking the oil level until there is a bubble-free flow of oil coming out from behind the diaphragms. The hydraulic cells are now primed. Replace the oil fill cap. Finally, wipe excess oil from around the pump head. Note: this method requires that the fluid end, or manifold and valve plate, be installed on the pump prior to priming of the hydraulic cells. For instructions, see the section on installing the valve plate and installing the manifold. Compressed air can be used to provide the required inlet pressure on the diaphragms. In order to use compressed air, you need to block the discharge port and apply pressure to the inlet port. This air pressure will hold the diaphragms back and allow the hydraulic cells to be primed of air when the shaft is turned. You can use the plugs available from Wanner Engineering, or your own plugs. Install a plug in the discharge port of the pump. Install the plug with a Schrader air valve in the inlet port. Apply up to 10 psi of air pressure to the inlet port. Turn the pump shaft with the shaft rotator tool from the toolkit. With the oil fill cap removed, watch for air bubbles in the oil reservoir. Continue slowly turning the shaft until there are no more bubbles. Relieve the air pressure on the pump head and remove the plugs. The pump is now primed. Non-Kel-Cell pumps do not have a K in the 5th position. With the pump horizontal, the fluid end head removed, and the diaphragms in place, fill the reservoir with the appropriate Hydra oil for the application. Have a catch basin for oil that is pumped from behind the diaphragms when priming. Catch the oil and dispose of it properly. Do not reuse the oil. All of the air in the oil within the hydraulic cell, behind the diaphragms, must be forced out by turning the shaft, and thus pumping the piston. Use the shaft rotator, which is included in the Wanner toolkit. Turn the shaft until a bubble-free flow of oil comes from behind all the diaphragms. Watch the oil level in the reservoir. If it gets too low during priming, air will be drawn into the pistons, inside the hydraulic end, and will cause the pump to run rough and require repriming. Check to make sure that the oil is 1 inch or 25 millimeters from the top of the fill port. Replace the oil fill cap. Wipe the excess oil from the cylinder housing and diaphragms. We will now reinstall the valve plate. Reinstall the valve plate with the valve assemblies installed onto the cylinder housing. Use the 4 socket head cap screws to attach the valve plate. Reinstall the O-rings on the manifold between the valve plate and manifold. Use petroleum jelly or lubricating gel to hold them in place. Reinstall the manifold onto the valve plate. Be sure the drain plug is at the bottom of the manifold. If the pumping head is non-metallic, support plate is also required. Insert all bolts, washers, and nuts around the edge of the manifold, and the center bolt with washer. Hand tighten. Install the center bolt with its washer and tighten it. Torque the center bolt to 45 foot-pounds or 60 Newton meters. Alternately tighten opposite perimeter bolts until all are secure. Torque to 45 foot-pounds or 60 Newton meters. You have now completed fluid end service for the HG25 pump. For additional information and instruction, click on the section entitled General Troubleshooting. If there is evidence of a problem in the hydraulic end of the pump, such as a grinding of the bearings, difficulty in rotating the shaft, or other similar symptoms, you would service the hydraulic end of the pump at this point. Now we're going to take a look at how to disassemble the hydraulic end of the pump. Do not disassemble the hydraulic end unless you are a skilled mechanic. Refer to the installation and service manual for your pump. These are available from Wanner Engineering, Wanner International, Wanner Pumps Limited, or your local distributor, or on the internet at www.hydra-cell.com. Complete specialized toolkits are available for servicing the hydraulic end of your pump. These are also available from Wanner Engineering, Wanner International, Wanner Pumps Limited, or your local distributor. The 4 bolts that screw through the back of the pump housing into the cylinder housing hold the cylinder housing to the pump housing. Do not remove these bolts until the assembly bolts are installed. The following service procedures refer several times to the Wanner toolkit. We strongly urge you not to try to repair the hydraulic end of the pump without using the tools in this kit. available from Wanner Engineering or your local distributor. Now we will see how to remove the pump housing. If you haven't already done so, remove the oil fill cap and the oil drain cap, and drain the oil from the pump housing. If you haven't already done so, remove the manifold, valve plate, and diaphragms. Inspect the pump shaft to make sure that there aren't any burrs which will cause problems while the shaft seals when the cam assembly is removed from the pump housing. Smooth any burrs or rough areas. Install the shaft rotator from the toolkit on the pump shaft. This will hold the cam assembly in place while you remove the cylinder housing. HG25 pumps are available with two types of pump housings. One has a bolt and nut fasteners around the perimeter of the pump housing, and the other has threaded pump housings. We will describe the service procedure for both types. The video will now stop. Please select the appropriate procedure from the section titled Pump Housing, Cylinder Housing Disassembly. Install the shaft rotator from the Wanner toolkit using a 3/8" hex Allen wrench. For bolt and nut type hydraulic ends, install the 3 assembly bolts from the toolkit through the cylinder housing and pump housing. Tighten the nuts to hold the pump housing and cylinder housing together. Remove the 4 socket head cap screws, which hold the cylinder housing and pump housing together. Alternate loosening the nuts on the assembly bolts. The piston return springs will force the 2 housings apart. Continue alternating the loosening of the nuts until the pump housing and cylinder housing are separated. Completely remove the installation bolts and nuts. Remove the cylinder housing. Remove the shaft rotator and pull the cam assembly from the pump housing. Inspect the cam and bearings and the bearing race in the rear of the housing. If the bearings are pitted or binding, or if the housing race is worn, contact Wanner Engineering. For threaded housing type hydraulic ends, screw the installation bolts through the cylinder housing and into 3 threaded sockets in the pump housing. Turn the nuts down until they are slightly tight. Remove the 4 socket head cap screws, which hold the cylinder housing and pump housing together. Alternate loosening the nuts on the assembly bolts. The piston return springs will force the 2 housings apart. Continue alternating the loosening of the nuts until the pump housing and cylinder housing are separate. Completely remove the installation bolts and nuts. Remove the cylinder housing. Remove the shaft rotator and pull the cam assembly from the pump housing. Inspect the cam and bearings, and the bearing race in the rear of the housing. If the bearings are pitted or binding, or if the housing race is worn, contact Wanner Engineering.